The philosopher's stone stands before the modern seeker not as a relic of discredited medieval chemistry, but as a fundamental epistemological problem that cuts to the heart of human consciousness itself. What does it mean to seek transformation? What is the nature of the substance we wish to transmute? And most critically, where does this transmutation occur? In the external world of matter, or in the internal landscape of psyche and spirit? The historical trajectory of this concept reveals a peculiar evolution in Western esoteric thought. The stone emerges first in Greco-Egyptian Alexandria, that crucible of Hermetic synthesis where Greek philosophical rationalism encountered Egyptian ritual technology and Judaic mysticism. The legendary Hermes Trismegistus, that thrice great fusion of Thoth and Hermes, articulated principles that would echo through millennia of occult practice. Yet the stone as a distinct object of pursuit crystallized most clearly in medieval Islamic and European alchemy, where figures like Jabir ibn Hayyan and later Paracelsus devoted entire treatises to its nature and production. Paracelsus, that iconoclastic Swiss physician magus of the 16th century, understood the stone not merely as a chemical reagent, but as the quintessence of nature itself, the concentrated expression of the world's soul that could heal all disease and perfect all substance. His threefold division of reality into sulphur, mercury, and salt provided an ontological framework that transcended mere laboratory operations. These were not simply physical substances, but metaphysical principles animating all existence. The depth psychological revolution initiated by Carl Gustav Jung in the 20th century reframed this entire tradition in profoundly illuminating terms. Jung recognized in alchemical symbolism a detailed cartography of the individuation process, the teleological development toward psychic wholeness that he identified as the central task of human existence. The stone, in this reading, becomes the self, that archetype of totality that integrates conscious and unconscious, personal and collective, masculine and feminine polarities within the psyche. Eliphas Levi, that 19th century reviver of Western occultism, insisted that all magical operations are fundamentally operations of will upon consciousness. The stone represents the perfected will, that adamantine faculty of directed intention that has been purified of all contrary inclinations and aligned with universal law. This interpretation positions the alchemical quest squarely within the domain of spiritual discipline rather than material manipulation. The premise that guides authentic engagement with this tradition must be stated explicitly. The true secret of the philosopher's stone is an internal, psychological, and spiritual undertaking. The laboratory apparatus, the cryptic symbolism, the enigmatic recipes, these serve as objective correlatives for processes occurring within the vessel of human consciousness. The furnace is attention, the prima materia is the unredeemed personality, and the final product is a transformed mode of being in the world. Those who seek literal gold miss entirely the gold of self-knowledge that the tradition offers. To comprehend the alchemical enterprise systematically, one must first grasp its fundamental ontological framework, the doctrine of the three philosophical principles. These are not the elements of Aristotelian physics, nor the chemical elements of modern science, but metaphysical constituents that structure all manifest existence. Sulphur represents the principle of combustibility, activity, and the soul. It is the animating fire within all things, the principle of desire and directed energy. In human terms, sulphur corresponds to the passionate, willful dimension of consciousness that which drives ambition, creativity, and transformation. Psychologically, sulfur aligns with what Jung termed the animus principle, the active, penetrating quality of consciousness that seeks to understand and master. Mercury embodies fluidity, volatility, and spirit. It is the mediating principle that connects above and below, the messenger that translates between domains. Mercury represents adaptability, communication, and the capacity for change. In consciousness, Mercury corresponds to imagination, intuition, and that quicksilver quality of mind that can shift perspectives and dissolve fixed categories. This is the psychological function that Jung associated with the mercurial trickster archetype, disruptive, transformative, and essential to any genuine psychic movement. Salt signifies fixity, embodiment, and body. It is the principle of crystallization, form, and enduring structure. Salt represents the material substrate that receives impression and holds pattern. Psychologically, salt corresponds to the ego's stabilizing function, to memory, to the accumulated experiences that form personality structure. It is what allows transformation to be integrated and sustained, rather than remaining merely ephemeral experience. The interplay of these three principles generates the entirety of phenomenal existence in alchemical cosmology. Their proper balance constitutes health and harmony. Their imbalance produces disease and discord. The alchemical work consists fundamentally in separating these principles from their corrupted entanglement in the prima materia, purifying each individually, and then recombining them in perfected proportion to produce the stone. This threefold schema resonates deeply with other esoteric traditions, revealing a perennial philosophy beneath diverse cultural expressions. In Kabbalah, we find a similar triadic structure in the three pillars of the tree of life. The pillar of severity, corresponding to the contracting sulfuric principle, the pillar of mercy, corresponding to the expanding mercurial principle, and the middle pillar, corresponding to the balancing Salin principle. The three highest Sephiroth, Keter, Chokmah, and Bina, likewise mirror this fundamental metaphysical division. Neoplatonic philosophy offers another parallel in its cosmology of emanation, the one corresponding to the unity of the perfected stone, the nous or divine mind, corresponding to Mercury as mediating intelligence, and the world soul, corresponding to sulfur as animating principle, constitute descending levels of reality from absolute unity to manifest multiplicity. The alchemical work becomes, in this reading, a process of epistrophy, the soul's return to its divine source through progressive purification. Rosicrucian doctrine, as articulated in the Fama Fraternitatis and Confessio Fraternitatis, presents the Philosopher's Stone as the central mystery of a Christian mysticism deeply informed by alchemical symbolism. The rose and cross themselves encode the fundamental alchemical polarity. The rose, volatile, mercurial, feminine, united with the cross, fixed, sulfuric, masculine, to produce the integrated adept. The Rosicrucian vault, that mystical tomb where Christian Rosenkreuz awaits resurrection, functions as an alchemical vessel containing the promise of transformation. The mentality required of the authentic adept differs profoundly from both the credulous superstition of the naive and the dismissive skepticism of the materialist. What the tradition demands is what Aleister Crowley termed scientific illuminism, a rigorous empiricism applied to states of consciousness. The adept must cultivate what might be called epistemological humility paired with experiential boldness. This means recognizing the limitations of conceptual knowledge while simultaneously engaging in disciplined practice to produce direct experience. The magical will in this context is not mere wishful thinking or psychological compensation for worldly impotence. It is the faculty of sustained, single-pointed attention directed toward a clearly defined aim. It requires the subordination of all contrary impulses and the marshaling of the entire personality toward transformation. This will must be distinguished from willfulness, the ego's desperate attempt to force reality into conformity with its desires. True magical will aligns personal intention with universal law, becoming thereby a conduit for transpersonal forces. The ethics of occultism, contrary to popular caricature, demand extraordinary moral rigor. The adept who gains knowledge of hidden causes and develops capacities beyond the ordinary assumes proportionate responsibility. Every action carries amplified consequences when performed from a state of heightened consciousness and concentrated will. The tradition consistently warns that premature assumption of occult powers without corresponding ethical development produces catastrophic results. The black magician, the failed adept, the soul lost in the byways of subtle realms. Most critically, the adept must maintain a disposition toward radical doubt, not the corrosive skepticism that refuses all commitments, but the philosophical doubt that questions all received wisdom and demands direct verification. The alchemical tradition is not a dogma to be believed, but a method to be practiced. Its value lies not in its theoretical coherence, but in its capacity to produce actual transformation in consciousness. The adept who clings to doctrinal formulations while neglecting practical work has understood nothing. The alchemical transformation unfolds through a precise sequence of operations that, while described in the cryptic language of laboratory procedures, actually delineate stages of psychological and spiritual development. The classical three-phase schema of Nigredo, Albedo, and Rubedo provides the fundamental architecture of this journey. Though more detailed analyses enumerate 7, 12, or even more distinct operations, the work begins with Nigredo, the blackening that confrontation with the shadow, with death, with the rejected and despised elements of the personality. This is the stage of putrefaction, mortification, and radical dissolution. The prima materia raw, unredeemed psychological content must be broken down completely before it can be reconstituted in purified form. All false identifications, all persona construction, all carefully maintained illusions about the self must be dismantled. Psychologically, Nigredo corresponds to what Jung termed the confrontation with the shadow, those aspects of personality that the conscious ego has deemed unacceptable and relegated to unconsciousness. This shadow contains not only personal repressed content, but also collective archetypal darkness. The individual encounters their capacity for violence, selfishness, cruelty, and destruction. They recognize how their conscious virtues have been sustained through projection of opposite qualities onto others. The phenomenology of Nigredo includes intense experiences of depression, meaninglessness, and existential dread. The structures that previously organized experience and provided purpose collapse. The individual may describe feeling that everything they believed about themselves was false, that their life has been built on illusion, that no authentic core exists beneath the social mask. This is not clinical depression as pathology, but what might be termed teleological depression suffering that serves the purpose of dismantling inauthentic personality organization. The operation of calcination occurs here, the burning away of superficial attachment. Through the fires of suffering and self-examination, What cannot withstand scrutiny must be reduced to ash. The operation of dissolution follows the washing, a way of residual elements through the waters of emotional catharsis and the surrender of rigid ego boundaries. The prima materia becomes a black, putrefying mass, the massa confusa, that contains all possibility but has not yet been differentiated or organized. The modern individual experiences Nigredo through various catalysts: profound loss, radical failure, the collapse of long-held beliefs, the eruption of previously repressed traumatic material. Therapy, properly conducted, can precipitate Nigredo by creating a safe container for shadow material to emerge and be examined. Spiritual practice may trigger Nigredo when meditation or prayer strips away consoling illusions and reveals the raw, unadorned reality of the practitioner's actual state of consciousness. The risk at this stage is twofold: premature abandonment of the process through distraction or numbing, or identification with the Nigredo state as ultimate reality, leading to nihilistic despair. The adept must understand that Nigredo is a necessary transition, not a final destination. The darkness must be endured, explored, and integrated, but not embraced as permanent truth. Following the complete dissolution of Nigredo, the work enters Albedo, the whitening or purification. Here the differentiation and separation of elements begin. What was a confused, undifferentiated mass in Nigredo now reveals distinct components that can be worked upon individually. The psychological equivalent involves the careful discrimination of authentic from inauthentic, essential from accidental, permanent from transitory elements of the personality. Jung associated Albedo with the anima-animus encounter, the confrontation with the contrasexual archetype that mediates between conscious and unconscious. For the masculine-identified individual, this involves recognizing and integrating the feminine dimension of the psych receptivity, relationality, feeling, and the capacity for psychological containment. For the feminine-identified individual, it involves integrating the masculine dimension, assertion, discrimination, logos, and the capacity for directed action. The operations of separation and filtration occur during Albedo. The adept learns to distinguish between different psychological voices and impulses, which desires arise from authentic need and which from neurotic compensation, which thoughts reflect genuine insight and which mere conditioning, which emotional reactions serve appropriate response and which perpetuate unconscious patterns. This requires developing what Buddhist psychology terms clear comprehension, a meta-awareness that can observe mental processes without immediate identification. The Albedo stage often brings a sense of relief after the torment of Nigredo. The chaos begins to resolve into order. Light returns after darkness. Yet this stage carries its own subtle danger: the temptation to remain in a purified but ultimately sterile condition. The white stone that emerges from Albedo represents the lesser work, a genuine achievement, but not the ultimate goal. The individual at this stage may become excessively spiritual, detached from embodied existence, oriented toward transcendence at the expense of immanence. Psychologically, Albedo corresponds to what Jung termed the synthetic phase of analysis, the period when scattered elements of the psyche are brought into relationship, though not yet fully integrated. Dreams during this phase often feature themes of washing, purification, encounters with luminous figures, and emergence into clarity after a period of confusion. The individual experiences greater self-awareness, reduced compulsivity, and increased capacity to respond rather than react. The modern practitioner may experience albedo through prolonged meditative practice that produces states of clarity and equanimity, through deep psychotherapeutic work that distinguishes authentic self from false self-constructions, or through philosophical study that provides conceptual frameworks for organizing experience. The albedo consciousness can observe its own processes with some detachment, can pause before acting on impulse, and can maintain perspective even amid emotional turbulence. The final stage, Rubedo, or the reddening, represents the completion of the great work. Here, the purified elements separated and refined during albedo are recombined in a new synthesis that unites spirit and matter, conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine in living, dynamic wholeness. The red stone, the true philosopher's stone, emerges from this final conjunction. Jung understood Rubedo as the realization of the self, that archetype of totality that transcends yet includes the ego. The self represents not an escape from personality, but the fulfillment of personality's highest potential. It is simultaneously the ground of being and the goal of development, the center and the circumference of the psyche. Rubedo consciousness maintains the discriminating clarity achieved in albedo while reintegrating the vital, embodied energy that was initially encountered in chaotic form during Nigredo. The operation of conjunction, the chemical marriage of opposites, defines this stage. The royal marriage of sun and moon, king and queen, Sulphur and Mercury produces the philosophical child, the Phileas Philosophorum. This is not a regression to undifferentiated unity, but an achieved integration that maintains distinction within relationship. The opposites that were torn apart and purified are rejoined in a higher synthesis that preserves their essential natures while overcoming their antagonism. Psychologically, Rubedo manifests as what Jung termed individuation, the development of the unique individual according to their own deepest nature rather than collective expectations or ego ideals. The individuated person acts from an integrated center rather than being pulled by competing subpersonalities. They maintain ethical principles, not through repression of contrary impulses, but through genuine transformation of desire. They relate to others from wholeness rather than need, from generosity rather than manipulation. The Rubedo consciousness experiences life with both detachment and engagement, maintaining equanimity while fully participating in embodied existence. There is a quality of groundedness, of being at home in the world while not being of the world. The individual recognizes their essential continuity with all being, while simultaneously honoring their unique manifestation. They have developed what might be termed paradox tolerance, the capacity to hold contradictions without compulsion toward premature resolution. Dreams in the Rubedo phase often feature symbols of completion, mandalas, perfect geometric forms, images of quaternity, the holy city, the cosmic tree. There may be dreams of marriage, of finding treasure, of ascending to heights, or descending to depths and discovering jewels. The individual experiences what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to generate new symbolic formations that unite conscious and unconscious content in creative synthesis. For the modern practitioner, Rubedo represents the capacity to function effectively in the world while maintaining connection to transpersonal dimensions of experience. It is the philosopher king, the enlightened householder, the saint who remains engaged with human affairs. This is not the false integration of premature synthesis, but the genuine wholeness that emerges only after the complete dissolution of Nigredo and the careful purification of albedo. The Rubedo state includes what might be termed post-rational consciousness, not irrational but integrating and transcending rational thought while preserving its valid insights. It combines the discriminating awareness developed in Albedo with the instinctual wisdom initially encountered in the chaos of Nigredo. The result is a consciousness that is simultaneously sharp and soft, focused and diffuse, active and receptive. Within the overarching journey from Nigredo through Albedo to Rubedo lies a particular crisis point that determines whether transformation will succeed or fail. This is the moment of maximum darkness, when the structures that previously organized existence have dissolved, but new structures have not yet emerged. It is the abyss, the void, the desert of the soul where no consolation remains. The alchemical texts refer to this as the moment when the crow's head appears, when the blackness of death seems complete. In mystical theology, this is the dark night of the soul described by John of the Cross, that period when even the sense of God's presence withdraws and the seeker experiences utter abandonment. In Jungian terms, this is the confrontation with the archetype of death itself, when the ego faces its own annihilation. What makes this crisis so dangerous is that it cannot be resolved through ordinary psychological mechanisms. Repression fails because the shadow content has already erupted into consciousness. Projection fails because the process has led to recognition of how projection operates. Distraction fails because all previous sources of meaning have been revealed as inadequate. The individual stands naked before the reality of their condition with no remaining defenses. The phenomenology of this crisis includes profound experiences of meaninglessness, not as intellectual conclusion, but as lived reality. Nothing seems to matter. All purposes appear arbitrary. The individual may describe a sense of ontological hollowness as though they were a shell with no core, an actor playing roles with no authentic self behind the performance. There is often a terrifying sense of unreality, of experiencing life as though through thick glass or from a great distance. Physiologically, this crisis may manifest as what appears to be depression, loss of appetite, disturbed sleep, psychomotor retardation, difficulty concentrating. Yet this differs from clinical depression in crucial ways. It has a telos, a purpose, and direction. It responds not to medication or behavioral intervention, but to patient endurance and deepening rather than escape. It is the psyche's way of forcing the dissolution of inadequate structure that must be transcended for development to continue. The temptation at this point is toward premature conclusion, to accept the nihilistic vision as final truth. If all meanings are constructed, why construct any? If all values are arbitrary, why value anything? If the self is illusory, why continue? This philosophical dead end has claimed many seekers who possessed the courage to enter the darkness, but lacked the endurance to pass through it. The esoteric traditions insist, however, that this crisis is precisely the point where faith becomes necessary, not faith as belief in doctrines, but faith as trust in the process itself. The individual must accept the dissolution while somehow maintaining commitment to transformation, despite having no rational ground for that commitment. This is what Kierkegaard termed the teleological suspension of the ethical, a movement beyond rational justification into authentic existence. The psychological mechanism at work here is what Jung termed enantiodromia, the principle that extremes eventually convert into their opposites. The psyche, pressed to the absolute extreme of dissolution and despair, spontaneously generates compensatory material from the unconscious. But this spontaneous emergence requires that the conscious position be maintained without compromise. The alchemists expressed this as maintaining the heat without allowing the vessel to crack. What distinguishes this esoteric crisis from modern pathology is primarily its context and intention. The pathological individual collapses into darkness through no choice of their own, possesses no conceptual framework for understanding their experience, and finds no meaning in their suffering. The esoteric practitioner enters the darkness deliberately, or at least accepts it as necessary, understands it as a stage in a larger process, and can locate meaning even in apparent meaninglessness through reference to the tradition's map of transformation. This distinction is not absolute. Much modern pathology may represent frustrated developmental impulses, lacking proper context and support. Conversely, much that passes for spiritual crisis may be pathology misinterpreted through spiritual language. The critical factor is whether the crisis leads to integration and development or to regression and fragmentation. The former indicates authentic Nigredo. The latter suggests pathological processes requiring clinical intervention. The role of the tradition, the teacher, the analytical container is to provide the necessary holding environment during this crisis. The individual must know, even if they cannot feel it, that this darkness has been traversed before, that emergence is possible, that the work is valid. The presence of another who has completed the work, whether a living teacher or the imaginal presence of the alchemical ancestor, provides the invisible support that allows the seeker to endure. The resolution of this crisis, when it comes, often arrives not through the ego's effort, but through surrender. The attempt to escape or overcome the darkness must itself be abandoned. Only when the seeker ceases grasping for salvation does the transformation spontaneously occur. This paradox that we must desire transformation intensely enough to endure the process, yet release all attachment to outcome, marks the razor's edge that the genuine adept must walk. The philosopher's stone, properly understood, represents a radically transformed mode of being in the world. It is not an object possessed, but a state embodied. The individual who has completed the great work, who has endured the dissolution of Nigredo, refined consciousness through Albedo, and achieved the integration of Rubedo operates from a qualitatively different center than the unredeemed personality. This transformed consciousness exhibits several characteristic features. First, there is a fundamental shift in the locus of identity. The ordinary individual identifies with ego, with the constructed persona that mediates between inner impulses and outer demands. The completed adept identifies with self, with that transpersonal center that includes yet transcends personality. This is experienced not as loss of individuality, but as liberation into authentic individuality, no longer constrained by defensive structures. Second, the adept demonstrates what might be termed functional paradox, the capacity to embody apparent contradictions without internal conflict. They are simultaneously humble and confident, detached and engaged, individual and universal. They can act decisively while remaining inwardly flexible. They maintain firm ethical principles while responding with appropriate nuance to particular situations. This is possible because their actions arise from integrated wholeness rather than from the victory of one subpersonality over others. And third, the completed work produces what the tradition calls philosophical gold, a consciousness that cannot be corrupted or degraded by external circumstances. Just as alchemical gold was thought to resist all solvents and remain pure, the philosophical gold of transformed consciousness maintains integrity regardless of conditions. This is not Stoic detachment or Buddhist non-attachment, though it shares features with both. It is active engagement in the world from a place of inner stability that cannot be fundamentally disturbed. The ethical implications of this transformation are profound. The adept who has integrated shadow no longer projects evil onto others. Having confronted their own capacity for cruelty, violence, and destruction, they cannot maintain the comfortable fiction that evil exists only outside themselves. This produces genuine compassion, not sentimental niceness, but clear-sighted recognition of shared human frailty and limitation. Simultaneously, the completed work generates enhanced moral responsibility. The adept who understands the power of will and attention cannot pretend ignorance of consequences. Every action, every word, every thought is recognized as efficacious, as producing real effects in the subtle as well as the gross dimensions of reality. The casual cruelty of the unconscious person becomes impossible for one who sees clearly the chains of causation they initiate. This heightened responsibility extends to the adept's relationship with others. Having achieved a degree of liberation, the completed adept incurs an obligation to assist others in their own process of transformation. Yet this assistance must honor the autonomy and developmental timing of each individual. The temptation toward messianic inflation, the belief that one must save others, must be resisted. The adept can only offer what the Buddhist tradition calls skillful means, adapting the teaching to the capacity of the student while maintaining the integrity of the tradition. For the modern individual, these principles translate into specific practices and orientations. The person who has done the work of psychological integration and spiritual development functions more effectively in professional life, not through manipulation or dissimulation, but through genuine competence rooted in self-knowledge. They lead not through domination, but through inspiration. They make decisions not from fear or greed, but from clarity about values and outcomes. In intimate relationships, the integrated individual relates from wholeness rather than need. They do not seek another person to complete them or to validate their existence. They offer genuine presence, see the other with minimal projection, and maintain both boundaries and connection. Their love is neither clinging nor distant, but participatory, engaged while respecting the other's autonomy. The completed adept maintains a particular relationship to knowledge and truth. They value intellectual rigor, while recognizing that not all truths can be captured in propositional form. They pursue both exoteric learning and esoteric experience. They understand that the map is not the territory, that all models are provisional, yet simultaneously recognize that some maps navigate reality more effectively than others. This is precisely why the discipline and rigor of the Hermetic school remains essential in an age of spiritual dilettantism and New Age superficiality. Authentic transformation cannot be achieved through weekend workshops, inspirational memes, or the purchase of crystals and essential oils. It requires years of sustained practice, careful study of the tradition, and willingness to undergo the complete dissolution and reconstitution of consciousness that the alchemical process demands. The school provides what the individual seeker cannot generate alone, a coherent body of knowledge tested across centuries, a community of fellow practitioners who provide mutual support and accountability, and access to teachers who have completed the work themselves and can therefore guide others through its challenges. The autodidact may achieve genuine insight, but without the corrective feedback of tradition and community, they risk the pathologies of inflation, delusion, and spiritual bypassing that plague solitary seekers. The ultimate result of the alchemical work is not escape from the human condition, but its fulfillment. The completed adept does not transcend embodied existence, but discovers what it means to be fully human, to actualize the potential that exists latent in every person, but which only a few develop through conscious effort. They become, in the language of the tradition, a bridge between heaven and earth, a conduit through which transpersonal energies can enter the world in forms that serve human flourishing. The vessel that contains the work is consciousness itself. The fire that drives the transformation is attention. The gold you seek has always existed in the ore of your own unredeemed nature, waiting only for the will that dares to separate, purify, and recombine what unconsciousness has left in chaos. The philosopher's stone is not found but forged, not received but achieved, not possessed but embodied, and those who understand this truth stand at the threshold of the great work, where all seeking ends and all becoming begins.